On April 22, 1908, the Star of Bengal sailed away from San Francisco for the last time. Its captain was a man who would forever be at the center of the story. Nicholas Wagner, Captain, Star of Bengal. Nicholas Wagner was a seasoned veteran of the seas, with a flair for the dramatic and a bullish bravado. The San Francisco Morning Call described him. Captain Wagner is known from Bering Sea to Valparaiso, a capable skipper and a brave man. He is described as a heavy-set man, about 50 years old, of great strength. When a very small boy, he was cast ashore in his father's schooner on the coast of New Zealand, and he is somewhat deaf from exposure. In 1905, Nicholas Wagner impressed the Alaska Packers Association. He went to Alaska and salvaged the sailing ship Balclutha, which had been abandoned on a remote beach the season before. Wagner oversaw repairs, restored the ship, and sailed it back to the San Francisco Bay for the APA, where it still sits to this day. Wagner was a hero. The APA rewarded Wagner by making him captain of the Balclutha. 1 year later, he became captain of the Star of Bengal. His little daughter, Helen, was 5 years old when he left for Alaska on the fateful voyage. She described the scene as the ship left San Francisco for the last time.
On board, the crew, canners, and fishermen, 138 in all, eagerly awaited the start. One young wife with 2 babies tugging at her skirts was praying, and here and there a rosary was thrust into the hands of the departing fishermen. The American friends of the officers and traders were on the dock nearest the stern, and handkerchiefs and jokes of bravado sent the Star off to the Arctic.
The Star of Bengal left with 2 less crew members than planned. The San Francisco Examiner reported, "The Alaska Packers have shown their men this season that they are firm in their intention not to allow drunkenness among the employees if they can prevent it. The company has suffered several losses through intemperance of its employees and is trying to ship only temperate men. A cook and a waiter who arrived drunk to sail with the Star of Bengal were discharged." Those 2 men had no way of knowing it, but they likely saved their own lives. I'm your host, Ronan Rooney. You're listening to Part 2 of Rise and Fall of the Star of Bengal, presented by Wrangell History Unlocked. Today's episode, Farewell. The voyage north could take weeks, a month, or even longer. It all hinged on catching favorable winds. As the ship made for open seas, everyone settled in for the long voyage. Captain Nicholas Wagner held the only private quarters aboard the ship, in the stern below the poop deck. His daughter, Helen, described it like this.
The walls of the cabins were of bird's-eye maple. In the dining salon hung a 6-foot oil painting of the Star under full sail outriding a hurricane. The swinging lamps were brass, ornately decorated with whale's teeth and carved ivories. In my father's cabin, curtains of red plush proclaimed the captain's aloofness. A telltale compass over his bunk and a rack of rifles within easy reach were additional furnishings.
While Captain Wagner could close the door for privacy, the rest of the ship's crew stayed in bunks and hammocks in shared quarters. In the forward hold, men were crowded even more closely together. Below the topmost weather deck, the 69 Chinese, 33 Japanese, and 4 Filipino men sat in the dark, windowless confines of the Star of Bengal's hold. Few stories about life in the hold persist, but in 1922, undercover journalist Max Stern landed a job with an APA cannery crew and described life aboard an APA ship inside the hold. It was dark, save from a stream of light that came through the hatchway. Scurrying about in the dim recesses of the ship's insides were the figures of my shipmates. They were holding candles they had bought from a caged-in store in the corner. The bunks, sides, and roofs had been whitewashed at one time, but they were far from clean now. I could see no means of ventilation, so I selected the one nearest the hatch hole I could find. There were 72 men in our Chinese gang, and all of them had been packed into the little forecastle in the nose of our ship. They had been there only a couple hours, but already the air was heavy and stale to a sickening point. The place was hot with animal heat. I could hardly breathe. As I followed our evening meal down the companionway and realized what a germ-infested hole it was, I felt something like Daniel must have felt as he entered the lion's den. Surely lions could be no more dangerous than the unseen myriads of disease germs that lurked in the dark corners of that damp, warm incubation hole. Over to the left of the forecastle, where the Asian men had all gathered, hung the strong foreign odors of Chinatown, a mixture of tea, fish, opium, and many other elements, but dominated by the overpowering smell of Chinese tobacco. The fetid stink of sweating, unwashed humans arose from every group and permeated the farthest corner of the Chinese hole. But my troubles had just begun. I turned suddenly deathly sick. I noticed several of my shipmates leaning over the rail, and I joined them. Soon I went below. I found that most of the gang had climbed into their bunks. Several had vomited on the aisles, and no move had been made to clean up the gorge. Utterly miserable, I picked my way to my bunk and rolled in. Max Stern called his series The Price of Salmon, but it became known by another moniker, Hell Ships. But the Star of Bengal made excellent time. Crew member Gustav Johnson credited the sleek design of the ship. In a letter to historian Harold Hike, he recalled, "Being out a few days, we sighted a ship called the Isaac Reed. She had all her sails set exactly the same as we had, and it did not blow very hard. She was supposed to be a real smart sailor. We sighted her 8 a.m., and at 12 noon we were right abreast of her, and at 4 p.m. was that far ahead of her that we could not see her at all." The Star of Bengal glided north under favorable winds, passing ships as it went. After a 2-week voyage north, a landmark appeared on the distant horizon, a sign they had arrived at their destination, Coronation Island. Coronation Island sits like a sentinel at the mouth of Sumner Strait. It is 35 square miles, sitting on the edge of the continent, exposed to endless pounding waves. It is pocketed with caves created by water eating away at the soft limestone beneath. On the west are large open bays. On the east, sheer rocky cliffs. To the south, Helm Point sticks out, marking the southern boundary of Sumner Strait. There are over 1,000 islands in Southeast Alaska, for over 18,000 miles of coastline. Sumner Strait is a rare passageway through the islands. In 1793, Captain George Vancouver sailed the HMS Discovery down Sumner Strait and named the island. Our course had been directed between Warren's Islands and the islands lying to the southward of Cape Decision. The southernmost of these is the largest, being about 7 leagues in circuit. This I called Coronation Island, the day of our passing, it having been the anniversary of that happy event. George Vancouver was talking about the coronation of King George III on September 22, 1761. King George III is perhaps most famous as the monarch to fight the colonies in the American Revolutionary War. As the Star of Bengal pulled up to the mouth of Sumner Strait, the steamship Chilkat was there to greet them. For the second year in a row, the Chilkat towed the Star of Bengal through Sumner Strait's bends and turns, right up to the dock at the Wrangell Cannery. On May 5, 1908, the ship tied up and began unloading. The season had officially begun. Wrangell's exports put it on the map. At first, it was fur. In 1834, the Russian-American company built Fort St. Dionysius near the north end of Wrangell Island to trade with Tlingit fur trappers. Wrangell's unique position near the mouth of the rushing Stickeen River makes it an ideal place for trade all the way up into interior Canada. The Tlingit village at the south end of Wrangell Island moved north and rebuilt surrounding the Russian fort. By 1840, the Russians leased the fort for 1 decade to the British Hudson Bay Company, which renamed it to Fort Stickeen. As demand for fur in Europe and Asia declined, so did the fur trade in southeast Alaska. In 1861, members of the tribe took Alexander Buck Chalkette up the Stickeen River, where he panned for gold until making the discovery that kicked off the very first gold rush in Alaska, the Stickeen Gold Rush. Wrangell became the de facto stopping place for fortune seekers on their way up and down the Stickeen River. In 1872, a second gold rush struck the Stickeen River, this time the Cassiar Gold Rush. While Fort Wrangell was under a U.S. flag and a collector of customs was on hand to levy taxes, the federal government did little in the way of governing. The U.S. Army came and quickly went. It was mayhem. In 1898, Fort Wrangell benefited from the biggest gold rush yet, the Klondike Gold Rush. There were many routes to the Klondike, each of them challenging in its own way. The path to the Klondike up the Stickeen River may have been among the worst. And still, throngs of eager opportunity seekers came to Fort Wrangell and loaded onto steamships up the Stickeen River. In 1897, Presbyterian missionary, the Reverend Dr. Clarence Thwing, wrote, "There is quite an increase of business and population in the quiet town of Wrangell, owing to the opening of a trail from the head of the Stickeen River to Teslin Lake at the head of a tributary to the Yukon. This is an excellent way of going to the gold fields, and there has been already a foretaste of the coming rush in the coming year. Hotels, warehouses, and dwellings are going up here as fast as the lumber can be turned out by the sawmill. Sad to say, there is a prospect of more saloons, beer shops, dance houses, and places of ill fame. Shall we also have more agencies for the extension of the kingdom of Christ?" While previous gold rushes came and went, the Klondike Gold Rush created a lasting change in Wrangell. Its population swelled, and it became one of the leading cities in Alaska. But Wrangell couldn't count on a gold rush. It looked for a sustainable industry. Canned salmon came at just the right time. A government report at the turn of the century by Jefferson F. Mosier included a history of Wrangell's cannery.
In 1887, the Aberdeen Packing Company of Astoria, Oregon, built a cannery on the Stickeen River, about 8 miles above the mouth, with the intention of making the entire pack from the catch of this river. After packing 2 seasons, in the fall of 1888 and spring of 1889, the cannery was moved to Point Highfield on the northern end of Wrangell Island, and operations commenced under the name of the Glacier Packing Company. In 1892, it entered the Alaska Packing Association and was closed. In 1893, it joined the Alaska Packers Association. The cannery is located in a small bight to the eastward of and just inside of Point Highfield, about 1.5 miles from the Wrangell Post Office and 2 miles from the flats at the mouth of the Stickeen River. In 1896, the cannery employed 20 white fishermen and received the catch of 70 natives. In the cannery were 8 whites, 4 native women, and 80 Chinese.
Long 2-story red buildings stretched out over the water on pilings, dotted by rows of white-trimmed windows. Eager seagulls circled the buildings waiting for scraps. During the season, steamship tenders regularly deposited fresh-caught salmon at the cannery dock. The cannery was isolated from Wrangell below. No roads connected it to the city. The terrain between was rough, thick, and uneven. To get there, people typically visited by boat. In 1908, just before the Star of Bengal returned to the Wrangell cannery, the Douglas Island News wrote, "Jens Nelson is the 3rd man in as many years to lose his life in the attempt to navigate a skiff from Wrangell to the APA cannery, about 1.5 miles distant, while illuminated with a brilliant jag. The physical isolation wasn't the only thing separating the cannery from Wrangell. Racial animus kept Asian men at bay. In March of 1908, just 2 months before the Star of Bengal arrived, a mob in Wrangell prevented Hindu men from landing at the dock. On March 16, 1908, the Vancouver Daily World wrote, "May Forrest of Juneau has received advices from a deputy marshal at Wrangell that 20 Hindus are aboard the Cottage City bound here. The Wrangell people formed a mob, which declined to permit the Hindus to land when they reached there. Douglas Island has already sent word that the men are not allowed to go ashore there. The city council called a special meeting there Saturday afternoon to discuss plans to prevent them from coming ashore. The citizens declare that the men cannot come to Juneau." The Alaska Sentinel professed sympathy for the Hindu men, while also calling for immigration laws to, quote, "eliminate from this country much of this class of people." Up and down southeast Alaska, this type of mob justice was openly practiced and celebrated. Even newcomers participated in it. The newspapers added, quote, "There are enough English-speaking people here to do the work to be done." 1 week later, the same newspaper wrote, "With the sawmill, cannery, shingle mill, and Berg's mine running, and with a big cold storage under construction, and a saltery projected for the coming year, business should not be dull about this section. In fact, it now looks as if there would be a shortage of laborers to keep these enterprises running." The cannery workers were separated from the community of Wrangell by physical and social distance. There was never any intention or opportunity for them to become part of the community. The sailors, on the other hand, jumped aboard steamships and went out to the fish traps. They became fishermen for the summer. The APA kept their fish traps close enough to deliver fresh-caught salmon to the dock in under 24 hours. Years later, Thorolf Anderson described the summer fishing season of 1908.
"I was assigned to the crew that was to attend to the stationary trap that we set at the mouth of a small river. We had very little work to do after the trap was set. When the salmon began to run, a tugboat with a barge in tow would come out every other day, and we'd have to bail the fish out of the trap into the barge. Some days we'd have a heavy run, and would bring in from 25,000 to 30,000 salmon. On days when the run is light, we would go out with a perch or drag seine and bring in several thousand salmon. But most of the time, we read, play cards, or go hunting."
The fishermen were represented by a union, which almost threatened to derail the fishing season of 1908 until an agreement was made with the APA. According to the San Francisco Call, "There is a slight revision of the wages for the fishermen who will work at Wrangell and Pyramid Harbor. Instead of the men being paid percentage for the number of fish caught, they will be paid by the case." The men who packed the cases had no such union. They worked with an arm's-length relationship to the Alaska Packers Association. As superintendent of the Loring Cannery, J.R. Heckman described it,
"It is a contract. I suppose you would call it employed direct. One Chinese man takes the contract to do the work for so much a case, and he employs his own men."
On May 14, 1908, the man in charge of it all, Jacob Babler, arrived in Wrangell. The Alaska Sentinel wrote, "Superintendent Babler and family arrived up in the Seattle, all looking natural and well. The cannery crew is busy getting the fishing gear and other paraphernalia in readiness for business, and Mr. Babler will probably soon send his trapmen out to get the traps in proper condition for fishing." As newspapers and interviews would later reveal, everyone called him Mr. Babler. Babler was a 50-year-old Swiss immigrant. Years earlier, he moved to San Francisco and joined the Alaska Packers Association. They sent him to Wrangell. Over a decade, he proved a shrewd manager of the cannery. As the Alaska Sentinel said in 1907, "If there are any fish in the country, Mr. Babler always gets them." Babler pounced on streams used by Tlingit fishermen. In 1898, a government report by Jefferson F. Mosier identified sites popular with the Wrangell Cannery, including Old Village, Anan, and Kashitz. After Babler seized a stream, he excluded Tlingit fishermen. In 1899, a group of Tlingit men from Wrangell wrote to the governor of Alaska,
"Dear Sir, Jacob Babbler claims he owns the place and wants to keep the other Indians away from there. Jacob Babbler tried to buy it from Aaron, provided Aaron keep all the other Indians away from the Salmon Creek. That Aaron would not do so. The troubles come in. Jacob Babbler broke and sawed down Aaron's fence and got in on Aaron's garden, using it for campground. We Indians of Wrangell can say this much, that we never tried to keep any white man away from fishing in the creeks. They have always fished every place. But when they tried to keep us out and tried to take the ground away from us, we think we have the right to kick.
Decades later, in 1949, Francis Paul testified about the elimination of fish traps. He remembered the 1908 season, and one member of the crew in particular. In 1908, Fred Matson, an old-time fisherman who was with a crew which fished for Alaska packers at Annan Creek, one crew with 150 fathoms got over 900,000 salmon at Annan. Between the opening dates in 1906 and the present, comparing catches, there shouldn't be any question as to the fact of depletion. Canneries in Alaska initially employed Tlingit locals as fishermen and packers, but canneries found they could not exert pressure over these employees. Treated harshly or unfairly, Tlingit employees could walk off the job and live off the land and sea. Chinese workers, on the other hand, were completely dependent upon the cannery system for food, shelter, and the return voyage home. Canneries put pressure on traditional Tlingit ways of life, offering little economic benefit in return. Fish trap operators didn't just ignore ancestral rights, they ignored Uncle Sam's own regulations as well. The July 16, 1908 Alaska Sentinel wrote, "Fish Inspector Cobb found 30 traps wide open and catching salmon during the prohibited hours. 9 were making a feeble attempt to comply with the law, and only 1 trap was following the law to the strict letter. A remarkable fact about this trap is that the owner had his other traps in full blast. The fishermen and cannerymen who have been caught almost red-handed have rendered themselves liable to a fine of from $1,000 to $5,000 or 90 days at hard labor, or both. Inspector Cobb has no alternative other than to place his report in the hands of the district attorney." By 1908, Jacob Babbler had been superintendent for around a decade. He found work for his family at the cannery. In the past, he employed his sister's husband as a maintenance man, carpenter, and as a winter watchman. In 1908, for the second year in a row, Mr. Babbler employed his wife's brother, Norman Hawkins, as a machinist at the cannery. Norman Hawkins would sail home to San Francisco aboard the Star of Bengal with all the fishermen and cannery workers at the end of the long season. With nothing to do all summer while the Star of Bengal sat at dock, Captain Nicholas Wagner went hunting with Mr. Babbler's 19-year-old son, Ansel. The Alaska Sentinel reported, "Captain Wagner of the Star of Bengal, Gussie Hansen, Ansel Babbler, and George Snyder went over to Zarembo Island Saturday in quest of Mowich. Ansel killed 1 and captured 1 alive, while the rest of the party got 0. This was Ansel's first deer, and Mr. Babbler Sr. says the young fellow has killed the same deer 40 times since Sunday. The live deer is enclosed at the cannery." Thoralf Anderson recalled when the end of the season came.
"Without a warning, the salmon run is over, and we are ready to take up our trap. Just a net, the Spilinger left. The tugboat company arrived with the bunk scow, and we are on our way back to the cannery and hard labor again. Everything is stored away. The cases of canned salmon are loaded on board ship."
In the summer of 1908, the APA cannery in Wrangell produced 52,062 boxes of canned salmon, each box weighing about 65 pounds. Down in San Francisco, local businesses eagerly awaited the arrival of the salmon fleet. The San Francisco Call.
The waterfront is waiting expectantly for the ships of the salmon fleet to put in an appearance. Shipping has been quiet for some months and work along the shore scarce. When the salmon ships get in, however, the period of financial stringency will be over for hundreds of those whose money comes as the price of hard physical labor. The vanguard of the fleet is in, but the rush has not yet started. In a few days, the salmon carriers will begin to show up in twos and three, and within a few weeks, there will be a salmon ship discharging cargo at nearly every wharf along the city front. The fishermen will be back, a great army of free and easy spenders, each with a few $100s to get rid of before another job receives consideration. As the fishermen and cannery hands insist upon getting ashore just as quickly as possible after the anchor is down, the launch owners along the front reap a substantial harvest in ferry fares. The longshoremen will find all the work they can get away with in unloading the ships and reloading the salmon into the steamers, sailing vessels and cars used in distributing the season's catch to the markets of the world. The fees for bringing the ships into port will gladden the hearts of the pilots, and the waterfront saloon keepers are radiant with the kind of smile with which they welcome the fleet.
In 1908, Bill Taylor was a boy in Wrangell when his father, William Sr., landed a job aboard an APA steamship towing the Star of Bengal. Young Bill talked his father into taking him along for the ride, including the party the night before. Decades later, Bill described the party like this.
The night before that, we had a big farewell party in town here. There was no road over to the cannery. You couldn't get over there only by boat or through the woods with a trail going over the cannery. So, when we pulled out, we went right straight out, and the farewell party lasted all night, the whole night through. And I understand that nobody went to bed that night. All goodbye to the cannery people. And there was about 150 people altogether at the cannery. Mm-hmm. There were 90 Chinamen, and there was about the same number of white people, and all the salmon, 72,000 cases of salmon. And the crew, of course, they were drinking, celebrating. The weather was so nice that the skipper on the Bengal, he didn't think anything of any danger ahead or nobody else.
The one man not joining the celebration was the superintendent, Mr. Babler. He had to have his papers in order for his superiors in San Francisco, who would scrutinize his records. And yet, above his head, Thorolf Anderson was making a racket. Years later, Thorolf Anderson recalled,
"We are to leave the next morning on high tide for the open sea and home, and we are all happy. In fact, so happy, we were crazy the night of September 18. We nearly tore down the bunkhouse above the storeroom and Mr. Babler's office, the superintendent. We marched around the room, stomping our feet and dragging whatever we could pry loose, sea chests, tables, and chairs. I was marching with a 30-30 Winchester rifle on my shoulder in the spirit of the fun. I twisted around and pointed the gun at the man behind me and pulled the trigger. I'm shivering now to think what would have happened if the gun had been loaded. Several times Mr. Babler sent his boy up while this madhouse procession was going on and asked us to quiet down as he was trying to do some work down in his office. But we didn't pay any attention to his pleading. We kept it up until the small hours of the morning."
All anybody had to do was make it aboard the ship the next day by 8 a.m. The sun broke over the horizon around 6 a.m., filling the gray, overcast skies with light. Despite the clouds, the morning of Saturday, September 19, 1908, was exceptionally calm. From the end of the cannery dock off the north point of Wrangell Island, you could see for miles in many directions. Still waters and no sign of trouble at all. For years to come, people would talk about how quiet it was. Thorolf Anderson.
"Not a breeze is stirring. We are calmly eating breakfast after a night of vile disorder. Everyone is quiet like a calm after a storm. After breakfast, we move our belongings on board ship. It is time to cast off and be on our way. I wonder if anyone ever thought that the vile antics of the night before were a sign that disaster was to follow.
Nobody expected trouble, but shipwrecks were a fact of life. Just 1 month before, the square-rigged sailing ship Lucille wrecked in Alaska, carrying thousands of cases of salmon. The San Francisco Chronicle wrote, "The accident through which the Lucille was wrecked occurred on August 18th, while the ship was laying off what is known as Smoky Point, waiting for favorable tide conditions to get away to this port with her cargo of 39,000 cases of salmon. All preparations had been made for the ship to be towed out of the harbor on the 19th, and extra precautions had been taken to hold the heavily freighted ship by her anchors until morning. During the night, however, the tide began to run strong, and a heavy gale sprang up. Suddenly, the swivel which held the anchor chains snapped, and the ship swiftly turned with the tide and in a short time went ashore on a sand pit." Like the Lucille, the Star of Bengal would be towed to sea. For 2 years, the 172-ton steamship Chilkat single-handedly towed the Star of Bengal to and from sea. But on the morning of September 19th, the Chilkat wasn't there. As a substitute, Mr. Babler arranged for 2 smaller steamships to tow the Star of Bengal together. The first was the 115-ton steamship Kayak. The steamship Kayak was relatively new, only 7 years old, designed and built in California for the APA as a fish tender. In 1907, the Kayak towed the Star of England alongside the 42-ton steamship Arctic. High seas made it impossible to navigate, and the ships sheltered at anchor for 3 days. This year, Mr. Babler arranged for the Kayak to tow alongside a steamship twice the tonnage of the Arctic, the 81-ton Hattie Gage. The Hattie Gage, towing off the port side, was shorter and lighter than the Kayak, but was an old, reliable steamship with nearly 20 years of service in Alaska. When the Hattie Gage launched, the San Francisco Chronicle reported the ship was 82 feet long, 20 feet wide, and featured compound engines capable of 10 knots. The newspaper said, "Even without much ballast, the vessel rides the waves beautifully." As the ship pulling from the left or port side of the Star of Bengal, the Hattie Gage was officially in the lead position of the tow. Therefore, its captain was in charge of the whole towing operation. He was a man with years of experience in Alaska and beyond. Irwin Farrer, captain of the steamship Hattie Gage. September 19, 1908 was Irwin Farrer's 47th birthday, but there was no time for celebration. He had a job to do. Irwin Farrer was an experienced seaman. He became a Coast Guardsman at 17, and by 18 he had his master's papers. He spent much of his career taking vessels from San Francisco and Seattle. In the 1890s, he was caught importing Chinese immigrants and opium near the mouth of the Columbia River. To avoid appearing for charges, he fled to Alaska. Despite his background, he became a well-known and respected steamship captain for the APA. His son, Frank Farrer, followed in his father's footsteps and served as a member of the crew of the Hattie Gage, including the voyage on September 19th. For the Kayak, Mr. Babler selected a man with years of experience as a mate, but who had never before been a captain of a ship towing to sea. Patrick Hamilton, captain of the steamship Kayak. People called the 51-year-old Irish immigrant Paddy. He was most well known at the APA cannery in Loring, near Ketchikan, where the Kayak normally tied up. Before departing, Captain Wagner hosted a festive party in the stern of the Star of Bengal. The group posed for a photo. There was a well-dressed man with a terrier on his lap, a man holding a drink, a woman dressed in a dazzling white gown with a hoop skirt, and next to her, Norman Hawkins, Mr. Babler's brother-in-law, slumped at the wheel of the ship, perhaps still feeling the effects of the previous night's celebration. Captain of the Kayak, Patrick Hamilton. Left the dock about 8:20 a.m., went alongside the ship and put a line aboard on the starboard side. Got fast and went ahead. The bow of the Kayak was past the stern of the Hattie Gage, probably 16 or 15 feet. Young William Taylor was aboard the Hattie Gage with his father. He recalled,
And when we pulled around here from the APA cannery where the airport is now, big cannery, great big cannery. We towed the ship around, and we had a companion tug called the Kayak, Captain Patsy Hamilton. The two tugs each had a tow line of their own. She was on the outside of us, and we were on the inside. We come around the point there, and these three accordion players was going, the prettiest tune, the prettiest music you ever heard comes over the water. Oh, it's beautiful. Steamboats don't make any noise. So anyway, not being a fireman or nothing much to do, I was out on deck taking in the sights. We come right out here and we hesitated in front of the town while they played. Then pretty soon we steamed out. Beautiful day. Sun was shining and the water was just exactly like a mirror. Just exactly. You could see the reflection of the hills and all. So out we went.
Wrangell slipped into the distance. Down in the hold of the Star of Bengal, cannery workers prepared for the long stay at sea. Would it be weeks, or even a month? No one could know. Up on the weather deck, the fishermen resumed their role as sailors, taking commands from Captain Nicholas Wagner and First Mate Victor Johansen. In the kayak's logbook, First Mate Fred Wilkie kept notes.
9:50 a.m., Two Tree Island. 10:45 a.m., Station Island. 11:55 a.m., Northerly Island. 3:45 p.m., Point Baker.
Frank Uberweimer, a deckhand aboard the kayak, observed, "It was still fine weather after we passed Point Baker, especially in the evening. It started calm. Dead calm." The three ships made good time, averaging 5 knots. They reached the bend in Sumner Strait at 8:25 p.m., the same time as nautical twilight.
8:25 p.m. Changed course to south. Wind freshening. Very dark night. Lights and lookout attended to. By evening, we sighted Coronation Island in the far distance on the starboard bow. By now, a strong breeze was blowing off our port beam. It's getting dark now.
As darkness fell, Captain Nicholas Wagner decided to get some sleep. At 10 o'clock, he ordered crew member Alf Olson to fire up the steam donkey, which the ship would need when it came time to pull up the sails. Captain Wagner then went below deck into his private quarters, leaving the mate in charge. Far ahead, on the distant horizon, beneath the dwindling twilight, sat Coronation Island and the fate ahead. After a half-day's journey east, the ships now rounded the bend, heading south. Just before the sunset's last light faded, the crew saw the shape of Warren Island far ahead on the left and Coronation Island on the right, and in between, the wide-open Pacific Ocean. The following are direct eyewitness quotations. Patrick Hamilton, captain of the kayak. Along about 10 o'clock, little swells commenced to come in, not much wind, fresh breeze, nothing to bother about. The vessel didn't seem to be getting through the water very fast. Quite the current coming along about that time. Irwin Farrer, captain of the Hattie Gage, steered the three ships toward the open ocean, carefully avoiding reefs off Warren Island. We were going along nicely until about midnight. Suddenly, the weather turned. Bill Taylor.
And as the tide changed, the westerly wind came up. And when the westerly wind comes up in this country here, you'll notice yourself that when it comes up with a bang.
The wind increased to a hurricane, and the seas were running mountain high. On board the kayak, First Mate Fred Wilkie wrote in the logbook,
12:30 a.m. very dark night. Steamer making very little headway. Ship drifting to leeward, having fore and aft sails set. 1 o'clock when the captain came on deck. We were then off Coronation Island. The weather was very rough, and the vessel was drifting rapidly leeward. The engineer had to stand by the throttle all the time because the propeller was racing. The breakers were visible on our starboard about 200 yards away.
Kayak engineer Walter Neal. Everything was going all right in the engine room, except she would race once in a while. The stern would go down and the raise up because of the big sea. Aboard the Hattie Gage, Captain Farrer could see the problem with his own eyes. The kayak was very light aft, and in the heavy sea her wheel was out of the water a great part of the time.
The kayak, she was pulling off to one side. She was a little smaller tug. She didn't have quite the power as the Hattie Gage had, but she wasn't an ocean-going tug. So when she hit the water like that, the stern would come up, the propeller would come out of water, then of course they couldn't steer.
Captain of the kayak, Patrick Hamilton. I always knew since I have known this ship, we would not come around very fast with a tow. She is a high wooden boat, has got a high house on her. Aboard the Star of Bengal, the crew got nervous. They woke Captain Wagner, who recalled, I was called from the cabin at 1:45 on Sunday morning and found the wind freshening from the southeast. The first intimation of danger was the sound of breakers alongside. It was readily clear that we had been towed too close inshore. I endeavored to attract the attention of the tugs to the danger by blowing the foghorn and shouting at them through the 4-foot megaphone till I completely lost my voice. Star of Bengal crew member Thorolf Anderson.
By now it was a real storm and pitch dark. All our sails were fastened down to the yards. Why we didn't set sail and cast loose from the tugs while there was still time to clear the islands, I don't know. I don't think anyone on board ship knew, including the captain. We could see we were not making any headway.
Fellow crew member Alf Olson.
We asked the captain to cut the hawsers of the kayak. He said he was not allowed to do it, but I was scared to do it without orders, and I thought it was a good thing to be done and save the ship.
The 3 ships were in a stalemate with the wind and losing. They were being pushed west. Erwin Farrer turned his bow east and pulled as hard as he could. If he could pull the Star of Bengal around, point it away from Coronation Island, the ship could fill its sails and cut loose. At 2 o'clock, the high bluffs of Coronation Island loomed up on our starboard quarter, and we tacked to port, thinking to safely pass the island and reach the open seas. I kept working off to the eastward. When I looked for the kayak, I seen his position was about the same. She did not follow me. I kept pulling. Alf Olson, aboard the Star of Bengal.
We could see the Hattie Gage trying to get us on another tack to get us offshore. We got on the starboard track and our jibs, they were full, and we're setting the topsails.
Bill Taylor, aboard the Hattie Gage.
But she just couldn't make it. Tried and kept on drifting toward the reef that is just outside of Coronation Island. Great big long reef.
Vessel's head got pointed to the northeast. I had just succeeded in getting the main topsail halfway up when the ship's head was dragged up in the wind again and she fell off again on a port tack. On board the Hattie Gage, Fred Wilkie recalled the failed tack.
During heavy squall, ship came back on port tack. We then steered southeast, trying to keep ship off the beach.
About 3 o'clock in the morning, the steamer Hattie Gage began to show weakness from this heavy strain. Her headstays were the first to go. Next, the smokestack guides. Then the boiler began to shift. We were repairing damages as fast as possible, and at the same time were making towards shore.
So when she come to this here high bluff there like that, a big wave come along and hit the boat like that, gave her a shove, and dislocated the boiler. The boiler moved about a half an inch.
On board the Star of Bengal, cook Frank Muir watched it all happen. On deck I saw through the darkness breakers all around, from the starboard bow to the port quarter, a small reef on the port side and the land towering back and forbidding about 300 yards away. In the cabin, the men were standing around looking very white. Then I seen the light on her forecastle head, bright light moving around, back and forth, and I made the remark, they must be getting anchors ready.
It didn't take us very long with the first one, so we attacked the other one and got it overboard, and we paid out all the chain we had.
I then had cast of lead taken and found 25 fathoms. I ordered anchors let go and dropped in 17 fathoms. Breakers on the rocks in plain view. Immediately, I dropped second anchor.
I then took the lead and sounded 17 fathoms. It was only 15 minutes later I had 10 fathoms. We were about 100 yards off beach, a large rock under our stern 20 feet distant, sea breaking around us.
The captain lost control of his own boat because it was too rough. They couldn't handle it, so he had to cut the tow line to save his own tug and his crew and get away.
On board the kayak, Captain Patrick Hamilton faced an impossible decision. At 3:50 a.m., the kayak was in about 10 fathoms of water and about 100 yards from the beach. A large rock was under her stern. The sea was breaking all around us. The rain came down in squalls. I was on deck and looked very carefully but could see nothing at all. I told Captain Farrer to get out and hollered to my men aboard my vessel to cut the hawser. The end of the kayak's hawser slipped into the sea. On board the Hattie Gage, Erwin Farrer faced the same choice. At 4 o'clock our sounding showed only 8 fathoms of water, and by the phosphorus we could tell that there were rocks all around us. Then, seeing that all hope of saving the ship was gone, we cut the tow line. Erwin Farrer bid farewell to the Star of Bengal. As he pushed into the darkness, he believed in his heart that the Star of Bengal had already wrecked. But he was mistaken. Next time on the rise and fall of the Star of Bengal, it's survival. The Star of Bengal's only hope are 2 little steamships in a race for their own lives. Before they can save anybody else, they must first save themselves. Rise and Fall of the Star of Bengal is a Wrangell History Unlocked production. Music from today's episode: Eternal Father Strong to Save, performed by the United States Marine Band. Auld Lang Syne and the Nutcracker from archive.org. Can Can Dance by the European Archive from museopen.org. In the Pines, performed by Mary Rooney. Remaining songs from the Wikipedia Commons. Zadok the Priest, performed by St. Matthew's Concert Choir. Reflections of the Moon on Urquhart, performed by Zhang Peijan. Jupiter from the Planets, performed by Skidmore College Orchestra. Parisian by Kevin MacLeod. Sound effects from epidemicsound.com. Thanks to our voice talent: Mary Rooney, Andrew Helgeson, Wes Strasburger, Brad Angerman, Asia Fisher, John Schenk, and Jake Henry. Thanks to the Clausen Museum in Petersburg, Alaska, for the transcript from Edward Thorolf Anderson. A big thanks to the team of researchers who visited Coronation Island in the summer of 2022 to search for the wreck: Sean Adams, Jenya Anachenko, Gig Decker, Sean Dillis, Tessa Hulls, Ray Troll, and Bill and Patsy Urschel. Thank you for sharing your passion and research, particularly the account from Gustav Johnson of the Ride North. Thank you, Greg McCormick, for your help getting the color of the cannery buildings just right. Thanks to Bonnie Demersion, Alice Rooney, and Steve Lloyd for offering feedback on early drafts of this episode. Bonnie Demersion is the author of several wonderful books on Wrangell history, and Steve Lloyd is the author of 2 gripping articles about the Star of Bengal, published in 2001 in the Puget Sound Maritime Historical Society's journal, The Sea Chest. Thanks to the eternal spirit of William Taylor, and thanks to Alice Rooney for capturing his voice and sharing so much more. You can learn more about the Star of Bengal at wrangellhistoryunlocked.com/star. You can read a transcript of today's episode, along with photos, maps, a timeline, and more. Browse around and check out some of our other features from Wrangell's rich past. Think you have a piece of the story that you'd like to share? I'd love to hear it. There are many mysteries about the Star of Bengal just waiting to be solved. You can email us at wranglepod@gmail.com. Tune in next week for our third episode, Survival. I'm your host, Ronan Rooney. Thanks for listening.